Introduce Louis De Palma. Louis, do you want to say hi to everybody?
Hello, everyone. Pleasure to be here. And I'm also very interested in hearing what Lisa has to say today.
Well, that's a little bit frightening. Louis, thank you for joining us. Louis is here to help me present. We're going to talk about driving profitability. It's actually kind of exciting because this is a brand new training that we put together. And we're really going to talk about how being an inclusive employer can actually help you as a business be more profitable. So there is the whole employment piece, which we'll talk about. And I also wanted to share some examples of businesses that have kind of looked at the customer journey and maximized taking an inclusion lens to be able to become more profitable. For those of you that are attending today, I will be sharing this deck out so you don't have to take notes. And if you have any questions, you can just pop them into the chat, or you can unmute yourself and gently interrupt me. I'm perfectly fine with that. So let's get started. So what is the Discoverability Network? Well, it's comprised of kind of three pillars. The first is a job matching platform that connects you as a business to job seekers with a disability. And that's to help you meet your labor market needs. And that's to help give people an opportunity to do a great job. The second thing we offer is free training on anything really related to disability or employment. So inclusive recruiting, disclosure, accommodations. Louis does some great training on the AODA. And finally, we offer networking events. And that's to help employers connect to job seekers to build your own confidence in talking about, what kinds of people you're looking for, what kinds of businesses you have, what kinds of job opportunities, and allow people with disabilities to connect to you to ask the questions they want in kind of a low risk environment so that everybody builds their capacity to understand and appreciate difference. Louis, you are the person that started this network. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, we started it thanks Lisa, we started it a few years back when we were crisscrossing the province pre-COVID days, giving presentations on the AODA. And what we quickly learned was that there was a talent gap, and it had been predicted years ago through some research. And so as we all know, what makes communities thrive and businesses thrive is having the right talent to meet business needs. So when we were talking to businesses and they were telling us about their needs across Ontario, and we were working in the disability space, we thought it would be a really good idea to connect persons with disabilities to employment opportunities. And that's how Discoverability was born. So we brought together 8 or 9 other business associations. We sat around a table and we created the Discoverability Network. And essentially that's what it is. It's a network that helps connect persons with disabilities to employment opportunities.
And we are thrilled to be having some chamber partners, including Milton, who's got us here today. So, you can look for local events that are happening in your area as well. So why is this a good demographic to connect to? Well, about 1 in 5 Canadians, or 6.2 million Canadians, have a disability. That's a gigantic segment of the population. I mean, Louis, did you ever expect that number to be that large?
Initially, it's gone up actually. When we first started, it's interesting, when we first started doing presentations on the AODA, the number was somewhere around 15% of the population. So as you can see.
That's right. It was 13.7.
So yeah, so it was probably, you're probably more accurate than I am, but you can see as we age as a society, unless we're extremely fortunate, some of our senses decrease, perhaps some of our mobility decreases, and that's probably one of the reasons why the number has gone up.
There's that. And the second thing is that the Statistics Canada actually reworded the question. And simply by rewording the question, more people identified as having a disability. So how we ask people whether or not they require an accommodation if they have a disability can affect the answers you get. So one of the training we actually have is about language and how to encourage people to bring their whole self to work. And the reason being is not because we want to know people's private business. It's so that as employers, we can provide the tools and changes, accommodations to the people that are working for us and with us so that they can do a better job. Now, interestingly, the #1 disability, as reported in Statistics Canada, is pain, flexibility, and mobility. And I think what Louis says is so important. As we age, these are very common disabilities. So I certainly know for me, I'm not as flexible as I used to. And, you know, that arthritis is kicking in. Mental health, particularly in COVID, I think is probably, this is a probably low estimate. Would you agree, Louis?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of organizations reporting that this number is higher, but in the 2017 survey, 20% of Canadians self-identified as having a mental health condition. And this is a really interesting fact. 29% of disabilities are visible, meaning you could look at someone and get a pretty good idea that perhaps there's a difference there, but 71% are non-visible. So there are benefits to hiring people with disabilities. So those include cost savings. So I know employers like this stat more than any other, up to 72% higher staff retention. But working alongside people with disabilities lowers overall staff turnover by as much as 30%. So hiring people with disabilities not only improves your overall company retention, it can lower turnover with your staff without a disability. Productivity. We know that employees with disabilities rate average or above average on job performance, 90% of them. 86% of employees with disabilities rate average or better on attendance, and 98% of employees with disabilities rate average or better on safety. These are just a few of the facts. There's a lot more out there. We have a whole webinar that delves more deeply into these topics. But before we get into talking about what businesses have done to improve their customer journey and increase profitability through inclusion, I wanted you to at least have a common understanding. Now, this is interesting, accommodations. Usually at this point, people start worrying. What is an accommodation? Louis, do you want to handle that? Because I think you do this a lot better than I do.
Well, accommodation is something that businesses have been doing for a very long time. Okay, when the AODA was enacted in Ontario, I think it became more prevalent. People became more aware of it. It became codified. It was part of rules and regulations under a piece of legislation. But as far back as I can remember, and I can remember quite a long ways back in the 80s, let's say, and even prior to that, businesses were accommodating. The first time an employee came to an employer and said, instead of coming in at 9 o'clock today, can I come in at 10:30 because I have something to do with my kids at school? And the employer said, yes, no problem. That is an accommodation.
So it's simply a change. So that could be around flexibility, time, so that an employee can do their job. And we just happen to provide accommodations to employees with disabilities, but not all people with disabilities require an accommodation. In fact, most don't. And of those that do, it's usually a one-time cost of $500 or less. And it really is there to enhance employee productivity so that the essential duties of the job get done and that standards are not lowered. Okay, so let's talk about innovation and the core of, I'm going to actually pause there for a minute. Does anybody have any questions? Scott, can I have you read out if there are any?
I can. I'm not sure if you know, but we're not seeing anything on the screen yet either.
Oh, I did not know that. Let's try that again. No, I did not know that at all. And that is not good. Let me just try that. I apologize. So heads up in future, if my screen is not sharing, please let me know. Are we able to see that, Scott?
No.
Oh, okay. Try it once more. How about there?
No.
Wow.
Okay. Lisa, if you wanted to either email it to me or maybe to one of Scott's staff, maybe we could share it.
Sure. Can we just take a pause there for a minute then?
Yeah, maybe one of Scott's staff, because it's that way they may have more control of the.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you send it to Alyssa, she can do the share.
Thank you. My apologies, everyone. That's a first.
You can never discount gremlins.
You apparently cannot, especially on a, what is it, a Tuesday or Wednesday today?
Although today is leprechauns and not gremlins.
Yes, it is leprechaun. So I will blame them. Okay, let me try this once more to see if this will work. Well, does anybody have any questions while I'm trying to get the screen up?
So Lisa, I have one. What's the #1 accommodation in Canada?
And anybody see my screen now?
No.
No.
Yeah, apparently my Zoom's crashed, so my apologies. So did you receive that? Screen sharing has failed to start. Okay.
I haven't received anything.
So my whole system may be down. Okay, well, we can talk through if everybody doesn't mind, just us talking to it. You don't get the pretty pictures, but we can definitely just share a little bit more of the content, and I'll maybe spend a little bit less time, but I will share out the deck with you after we're done. Okay, so we come to business innovation. So if we're going to innovate in the workplace, then we have to be aware that the only way we innovate is when we have different opinions, different viewpoints. So when we think about that, where does that different viewpoints or perspectives come from? It comes from having people that work for us that are able to changes. So when we think about inclusion, okay, or when we think about companies that have maybe done inclusion well, anybody have any examples where you think that a company may be very good at disability that you hadn't considered before? Maybe somebody in the Milton area?
Well, Lisa, you know about some of the examples we have in
I'm here.
Oh, there's Stephanie. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Well, I mean, throughout the HR roundtable, there's been a couple of the member companies that obviously have gone down the pathway of partnering with different organizations to help bring different people with disabilities in internally. Yeah. Seen a lot of success through a few, particularly in the Milton community. We have a very large deaf community. What am I talking about? Yeah, so a very large deaf community. And there's a manufacturer in particular who, went through a couple of different organizations and brought in basically a whole team of individuals who identify as disabled, who otherwise, probably wouldn't have been hired through traditional employment channels. And the accommodations that they had to make for them cost less than, I think they said less than $500. It was like one mirror for forklifts so people can see, and signage. That's it.
That's such a great example, Stephanie. Thank you for sharing. So if you could see my deck, which you can't,
yes.
one of the
we can see it now. We can see it now.
Is Rockwool. Yeah. And Sodexo is another company. You can see I've tried to put a wide range: Apple, Microsoft, Sephora, Tim Hortons. So I'm going to talk about a couple of these examples in a little bit more detail, but all of these companies see disability as, you know, bringing value, difference, making them more inclusive. They have a significant segment of their worker population, and in both employees and customers. Inclusive companies are definitely more innovative and profitable. So there's just studies that, have recorded that. The customer decision journey is enhanced, and I'm going to take you through what I think that is. And then, of course, you're complying with legislation. And I put that last because it's the least important. So what are some companies that immediately come to mind in terms of having inclusive products and services? So I haven't chosen local organizations because that would vary from, region to region. I've tried to give you some examples that are probably more common. So the first one I've got here is OXO, Good Grips. Has anyone ever used these kitchenware products that have these black handles?
Yes.
Just wave wave your hand.
Yes.
They're amazing. Now, the owner of the kitchenware company that created this, Sam Farber, was a gentleman, and he actually retired. And, his company had done well, but he retired. And he eventually took a vegetable peeler that became the inspiration to build a new multi-million-dollar company. So how did he do that? Well, his wife developed arthritis and couldn't grip the kitchen peeler that they had in their home that his company had made for years. So he went back to his design company and said, make something that's easy for people to hold. But it turns out that not only people with arthritis, like OXO, Good Grips products, everybody does. If you have wet hands, if you just want a comfortable grip. That's 23 years ago that was created, and now they sell over 850 products worldwide. It's an amazing company, and in fact, when they created the name OXO, they did it as a little nod to inclusive design because you can read it from whichever direction you want. So they use the principle of what we call universal design, which is when you design products that work for everybody, we still get the majority in the middle, but they also capture the edges. People with disabilities, people with difference. So if we design thinking about everybody instead of like the majority or the average, we actually get something that works better for everyone. So that's a really great way of thinking. So they've designed products for young people, old people, males, females, left-handed, right-handed people, people with disabilities. They've actually built their business on that whole idea. They've actually won an award for excellence from the National Arthritis Foundation as well. Next company I'm going to mention is Microsoft. So what I love about Microsoft is that they just keep moving more and more into the accessibility and inclusive design space. It's actually embedded in their products. So if you're creating a Word document or a PowerPoint, they actually have inbuilt accessibility features. And they have accessibility checkers because they know that this helps more and more people be able to use their products and services. They've also created and made public and shared with everybody an accessibility evolution model that's 3 stages. And their thing is, if you want to become an inclusive company, you start with culture. From there, you move across the product lifestyle, you set standards, you design against those standards, and then you train. And finally, you're going to continue to innovate because you're not going to get it right the first time. So I think that's a model, whether you're in services or products, that works for everybody. It's free of charge. They have developed resources like Disability Answer Desk Playbook. They have disability hiring, accessibility at a glance. They've just, are writing their ticket with this idea that they want to become embedding inclusion across all their products and services. And finally, I don't know if you've seen this shoe. It's the Nike Flyies. They're not for sale yet, but this shoe is a hands-free entry. So basically, you don't have to tie shoes. So it was inspired by a young man who had cerebral palsy. and was worried about tying his laces. And the first iterations were wraparound with Velcro straps, but now you just slip your foot in. Turns out this is like the 7th iteration of that shoe, because people, not just people with cerebral palsy, but most people, or a lot of people, like being able to just slip on a shoe without having to worry. It's got a hinge on it. It's very, very cool. So it comes up for sale in a month or 2. So these are just 3 examples of how you can be innovative, but we can also innovate on places and spaces. So if you look to the left of the screen, you see this very cool staircase called Lift Up. This is a company, and they've actually created a staircase that turns into a ramp. Takes no more room than an average staircase. It's a lot more cost effective. You don't need this big long ramp in the middle of your store, and look at how great it looks. Really innovative. Now, if you can't put a ramp in, or you don't want to, Louis, I'm going to let you talk about stopgap, because you mention this quite often.
Yeah, we've all seen these in our communities. You know, it's where you have a sidewalk business and there's a lip, you know, at the entrance to your doorway. And obviously that poses some issues for folks with mobility concerns. So these stopgap little ramps, they're terrific. You know, retailers or businesses put them out. Sometimes they leave them out all day. Sometimes they put them out just when the need arises, when a customer with a mobility concern needs to access their business. But they're a great way to help people to enter and exit a building with a small lip on it.
Exactly. Other ways that you can make your places accessible: allow service animals. Simply putting up a sign that says service animals are welcome. Priority seating. Signs that show if you have, you know, inductive loops in your building, or, you know, just a button for people if they need assistance. Accessible washroom signs, even accessible trail signs. So there's lots of different ways that we can make our spaces and places more accessible. Louis, I know this is tapping into the AODA, but are employers responsible for putting in an elevator or putting in that push button?
There isn't anything in the AODA legislation that would compel a business to put in an elevator or to put in an automatic door opener. That's not part of that piece of legislation. That's really related to the Ontario Building Code. And obviously all new buildings will have to comply with updated codes. You know, existing buildings, you know, do get grandfathered in unless they have major renovations that they undertake. And at that point, they may have to upgrade to the latest building code, which I believe was updated at the last time about 2 years ago, roughly.
And I'm also going to ask you, because I have places up here. Websites are places. Do they need to be accessible?
Yes, they do. And as of January 1st of this year, companies with 50 or more, you know, when you're building your websites, they need to be WCAG compliant level 2A. Okay, so 50 staff or more, you need to be in compliance with that WCAG requirement. Lisa, perhaps I could talk a little bit just to add to what you just said about ramps and making your businesses accessible. You know how you talked about earlier, about 20% of the population have self-identified as having some form of disability. So, you know, when you take a look, families and friends and relatives that we have, roughly, you know, over 50% of the population interacts or you know, goes out and spends money basically with someone with a disability. So can you imagine if you're a business that is more accessible, and, you know, let's take the idea of a restaurant. You know, if I'm going out with a group of friends and one of the folks in my group has some form of disability, and that business that I want to access or restaurant is more accessible, we're more apt to stop into that business than a business where we can't all get in and share a good time together. So that's just an example of how being more accessible can drive that profitability, because why would you want to leave out 20% of the population? And why would you want to, you know, leave out potentially over 50% of the population?
It's so true. And I think people, when we talk about innovation, everybody thinks, oh, you're inventing a shoe that doesn't require shoelaces. But really what you're saying is it might be innovative to simply put a ramp into your building to allow, you know, over that little lip to allow parents with strollers, business people with luggage, somebody who uses a mobility aid to get into your facility. The odds are if you don't have people who represent these different viewpoints, you're not going to think about them. I mean, I don't personally use a service animal, so I wouldn't really think about, do I need to have a sign? I don't, currently use a mobility aid, so I wouldn't necessarily be thinking about innovating the entryway to my store by putting up this very inexpensive stopgap ramp. So there's lots of different ways to be innovative, and we're going to get those perspectives by thinking again about the edges, and oftentimes those come from employees who happen to have a difference, including disability. So if we look at the 5 stages of the customer decision journey, so how do they learn about us, which is awareness? How do they decide? What is it like to actually purchase the product? What service do we give? And are they loyal? There will be mismatches and opportunities on every stage of this journey. So let's think about awareness. How many of us were relying solely on walking by a storefront before COVID so that people would walk in? And we've all learned really quickly that suddenly digital matters, as we learned earlier in this presentation when my slides disappeared. We also need to be considering about consideration. And I think this goes back to Louis' point about 20% of the population has a disability. I think that number is low. But when we count in friends and family, it's around 53%. So our awareness and our making our facilities accessible and our products easy to use may affect people's consideration of whether they want to work with us and whether they want to be loyal to us in the end. There's a lot of data that again shows people with disabilities are much more loyal customers. Do we make it easy for people to purchase? Again, I'll go back to COVID because I think COVID's brought a lot of these things to the forefront. If somebody had to come into our store and pay cash, we're not going to be doing very well in this age of when we're all in our home purchasing on the computer via credit cards or PayPal or Apple Pay. How do we offer service? Again, are we offering service across a broad spectrum of difference? I always like, Louis, you always talk about ask the person, which I think is like a stand-in for the best customer service out there. Can you explain what that means?
You mean ATP?
ATP, Louis.
ATP, ask the person. That way you're always sure that whether it's an employment situation, whether it's a customer situation, and we all do this as businesses, we're very, very keen on making sure that our customers have the best experience they possibly can. Because if we do that, then, you'll have that customer not just one time, you'll have them many times. And really it's about taking a look at the customer experience for all demographics in your communities to make sure that, they're getting that proper customer experience so you get that repeat business.
So I'm going to just choose a couple examples of businesses that we work with that use our system to recruit or that I'm familiar with in some cases to talk about some of the considerations, mismatches, and opportunities along the customer journey. So the first one is a company that's just joined us recently, and their name is Fable. And what I really love about their philosophy is that they're saying accessibility isn't something you add on. It's not a widget you plug into an otherwise final product, and that includes websites. So it can be very difficult to make a website accessible if you haven't started with that from the ground up. So when we design processes, when we design websites, when we design products, we want to think about accessibility from the very beginning. Now, oftentimes the person who experiences the problem is usually the person who's going to be the best one to solve it. So Fable has built their business on that philosophy. So what they do is they hire people who use assistive technology, and then they sell that service to businesses who will then test whether websites or platforms or a point of sale, whatever it is, actually works for people with a wide range of disabilities. It's a great principle. And, it was founded in 2018. They offer inclusive contract employment to people with disabilities at a competitive wage with the ability to work remotely. And they now have over 200 employees and have formed partnerships with global companies and do work with the government. So this is a great example of somebody that's out there to help you, but is also an inclusive business and has built an entire framework on inclusion. Cohen Highly. I love Cohen Highly. I first learned about it when I worked with Ouden. Cohen Highly is an inclusive employer. They're also a law firm, and they've built their policies and an appreciation for difference that results in an equal and inclusive workplace. So they've hired individuals with both evident and non-evident or invisible and visible disabilities, everyone from law clerks, paralegals to legal assistants. Joe Hofer has a number of published articles on how you do this. He's a great advocate in this space for both local and provincial organizations. But basically, I think it was like over 20 years ago, they just decided they're going to do it. They said, we're going to bring in one person with a disability. It was for a part-time role, I believe. She ended up saving them so much money in terms of legal staff. She was doing things like scheduling, helping with the photocopying, getting rooms set up, that she ended up being a long-term employee. I believe she retired a few years ago, and they've now actually become an inclusive company across their entire organization. So it's a really great example of, again, in a profession you would normally, go, wow, this isn't going to work for people with disabilities. It does, because people with disabilities have abilities as well, and we need to focus on that. Sephora. So for those of you who don't know, Sephora is a French multinational retailer. They make personal care and beauty products, and they have about 3,000 brands. Sephora followed the Walgreens model, and they've actually made their distribution centers leaders by creating accessible environments that welcome talent with disabilities. They've created a structured 9-week training program. They provide equal pay for equal work, and they're trying to, embed the philosophy that all employees have, dignity, and we value talent in the different ways it appears. Now, that 9-week training program is actually 5 days of classroom training, 8 weeks on the job, but it's resulted in 30% of their Mississippi distribution center having a disability. And that's been so successful that they're rolling it out now to Las Vegas, Maryland, and Salt Lake City centers. They're also now asking their suppliers to also have inclusion models, because they're finding this is a great candidate pool to draw from. There's a really good video that you can look up Sephora disability inclusive employment, and you'll see that. Back to a different model. This is a small company in Toronto. They're a strategic consulting firm. They work with a lot of very, very large brands. And they have actually been working, we've been training with them for a couple of years. And they have actually ended up hiring their designer, whose design you see here is on the autism spectrum. I have permission to share his story, just in case any of you are going, oh, she shouldn't do that. And they just said he's been one of the best employees that they hired. Now, it required them to reconsider certain opportunities across their hiring phase. So what they ended up doing was doing non-traditional interviews with the candidate, meaning they let his work speak for itself instead of asking him to articulate it. And they ended up hiring him. You can see the beautiful work. It's grown their social media and outreach strategies. It's built a stronger customer base. All their materials have this beautiful design. And Aaron was actually brought on as a full-time employee. And again, the work is really, his visual sense, is, he'll tell you, is driven by the fact that he communicates differently. So again, another example of how there's an opportunity with both customers and internally by, hiring difference. This is usually one that everybody is familiar with. Magdalene Treadstone, Tim Hortons, Mark Wafer, whose picture is up on the screen. So Mark, over a 20-year period, hired over 125 employees, at least 17% of his workforce across all facets of his business. And he reduced his turnover 55%, so to an average of 38% in an industry area where it's between 75 to 100% turnover. Mark also ran some of the most profitable stores, Tim Hortons stores across Canada, and he'll tell you it's because his turnover was lower. So that was all profit that he got to keep. His stores never filed a WSIB claim on an employee with a disability, and his absenteeism rate for employees with a disability was 85% lower than industry average. Mark will also tell you that he looked at the onboarding costs for front of house staff, the people that are pouring the coffee, and he estimated it cost him as a business owner $4,000 to train a front of house staff. Now, if his turnover is, a third of what his competitors are, that's all profit. There's a lot of YouTubes and on Mark's LinkedIn that you can go and learn more about that story. Increasingly, we need to create accessible services, spaces, and places, again, across all these different areas, in customer service, in the information we provide and how we provide it. That would be in the search phase, in our built structures, how people actually get to, access our store, in our policies, how we're training people. There's actually now an app that is picking up worldwide. It started out in Canada. It was started by Mayan Ziv. It's called Access Now. And it's actually community driven, meaning you set up an account and you pinpoint accessible locations on an interactive map and then rate whether things are good or not. So people are making that customer decision that we were talking about based on what other users are putting into their app. So think about how your business might fare if you were on that app. And the likelihood as that grows, you will be on that app. The takeaway? Well, we're here to provide you with tools, additional training, job matching platform to help you recruit qualified candidates with the disabilities so that you can become a more inclusive organization and drive your profitability. If you have questions, you can reach out to me. I'd be delighted to help you. And I'm going to stop sharing now and see if we have any questions right away. And I apologize again for that blackout.
Thanks, Lisa. That was great. So we'll open up for questions if anyone has anything.
Or comments.
Or comments, sure.
And perhaps, Chris, if you don't mind, we could stop the recording so that way if people have questions,